Algebra Chapter 1, Lesson 5, we looked at the distributive property. I want to do 3 examples and make one more very important point to wrap up kind of the introduction, and then we'll look at a couple of uses for the distributive property. So let's do some examples where we apply the distributive property. So we have here 3 examples, and again, the distributive property allows me that if I have a multiplication problem here, which I do, a 3 times a parentheses, I can distribute this 3 to each term inside the parentheses. Now remember, there has to be no other sign in between here. This has to be a multiplication problem in order for us to do this. So what this means is I can take this 3 and distribute it to the x, so I can multiply it by the x, and I can distribute it to the 2, or multiply it by the 2. And so what I've done here is I've taken this number that's on the outside and I've passed it out to each member that's on the inside of the group, this addition problem. Okay, and then we can do some further simplification here by go ahead and multiplying 3x. 3 times x, we can remove the parentheses and just leave it as 3x, and then we have plus, and then we have the 3 times the 2, which would be 6. So this would be the simplified version of distributing this 3 inside this parentheses. Now we have a couple of different things going on in this second example, but it's still the distributive property, because even though this number is on the back side, there's still no indication of an operation between them, so the multiplication is understood. Multiplication is commutative, so the number being in front or behind doesn't matter, we can still multiply. And on the inside, the group includes 3 terms rather than 2, but it doesn't matter. Everybody in the group, it's a grouping symbol, everybody in the group gets a 6. So the x can be multiplied by 6, and I'm just going to skip this step here and go right to here. The y I multiply by 6, and the z I multiply by 6. Okay, and so this would be the example. Now remember what I said in the last video, that the distributive property is the only way to remove the parentheses. Notice that when I distributed this 3, my final answer didn't have any more parentheses. When I distributed the 6, the parentheses are gone. I performed the operation, so it removed the parentheses. So you'll notice as we go through, this is the only way you'll ever be able to get rid of them. Alright, in the last example here, I have 4 in the front multiplied by these 2 terms inside. Again, so I'm going to distribute. I get to multiply the 4 by the 2s, and I can multiply the 4 by the 5. Again, distributing that 4 to each term that's in the group. It's inside the parentheses. And then as some further simplification, removing these parentheses, I can multiply the 2 times the 4, which is 8, and s, and then I have the 4 times the 5 here, which is 20. So I performed all of the operations. And again, there are no parentheses. Okay, so distributive property, fairly simple. It's just some multiplication going on. Now, there is one important note that I want to make here before I close up this video, because we're going to need to recognize this in the coming videos, but I want you to think about it now while you're working on this. And think about this. When you distribute, all right, what I want you to notice, and it's really easy to see on this one, is that each value in the answer, because a 6 got distributed to each one of these, the final answer has a 6 inside each one. So there's a 6 in here, there's a 6 in here, and there's a 6 in here. Alright? Now that's kind of easy to see because they're all right there looking at you. But even in this one, what did we distribute into each term? A 3. So this term has a 3, which we can see. This term also has a 3. If I broke that 6 out into its factors, 2 times 3, you'll notice that both of these terms have a 3. And the same thing down here, even though it's not obvious, this term has a 4. 2 times 4 is 8, and this term has a 4. 4 times 5 is 20. So when you distribute something into a parentheses, what ends up happening is each term in your final answer actually has that number inside of it somewhere. Sometimes it's easy to see, sometimes not so easy to see. But that number that got distributed in is now part of that new term. And that's going to be very important, because when we talk about factoring, we're going to want to go backwards. We're going to want to look at this and go, well, what does all of these terms contain that I can take out of each one and do that distributive property in reverse, so to speak. So just keep that in mind as you're working through these, that each one of these terms that you end up with actually has now that number that was on the outside as part of it. And then we're going to want to be able to go backwards or reverse that process to help us do a couple of other things in this lesson.